Hi, Kate here with another video. Hope you're doing well. And if you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. I'm up to 129 subscribers. I thank everyone who subscribed. Helps me build the channel. Each video, I get a few more new subscribers and I lose a few. Either way, it's okay. Just make sure you know what you're getting into. I'm a strong anti-imperialist. I see U.S. imperialism as the worst force on the planet. I'm not, not like a third campus. So just make sure you know what you're getting into. Let's see. Yeah, I've had a bit of a hiatus since my last video or last time I made a major video. I had car problems. I had to sink a lot of money into my car. Everything's okay, but I was sort of a bit depressed. I wasn't in the mood for making a video. Things are okay now. My dog, Max, is right behind me. My dog's being incredibly needy today. I'm home and they're constantly bothering me for attention or want to go out or want to go for a walk. I've taken them for two really long walks already this morning. Okay, so this is on Ukraine on narratives. Another one on narratives, and earlier other videos I shared my feelings about CNN. I freaking hate CNN. There's this. I work in a school system. I work with emotionally disturbed kids, basically, and people work in school systems in the U.S. may know about something called CNN 10. What is it's a version of CNN for kids. News it's 10 minutes, what they call CNN 10. It's only 10 minutes. This guy Carl Zeus narrates it. He's intensely annoying, but they cover a couple news topics and lots of fluff and special interest, something about Elon Musk's space program or a volcano or something. And it's not. I hate CNN 10 isn't terribly bad, but it's mainstream narrative. So the other day, I think it was Thursday morning, maybe Friday morning, I can forget. That morning they had a thing on Ukraine, an extended segment on Ukraine. And I knew exactly what they were going to say, the mainstream narrative. They showed this bombed out apartment building and they showed a kindergarten. So some woman was walking around and showed a kindergarten, which was bombed out. She said, Putin's war, like Putin did this. But fortunately, they got the kids out. And this girl in the class, in my class, it's just tiny because most kids have no interest in the news. They're utterly disengaged. They're on their phones all the time. They're utterly disengaged. So one kid she's really smart, and she's smart, but she was like, "Oh, Putin's a piece of shit," And the whole thing, CNN 10 is total propaganda. Yeah, I mean, it's horrible bombing a kindergarten. Absolutely, absolutely. But let's have, I don't even know any of the context of that situation, but let's have some. So I've seen videos recently, and they're on Telegram, of Ukrainian Nazi groups, militias, shooting at Russian prisoners of war in the kneecap or in the groin and letting them bleed to death. This is on Telegram. I've seen the videos. It's horrific. There are many videos like this. There are videos and stories of the Azov and Mariupol, basically a Nazi militia in Mariupol, largest port in Ukraine. They were using civilians as human hostages, human shields, in effect. And I've heard horror stories about the right-wing Ukrainian Nazis. So let's have some perspective here. Yeah, I don't know. Evil Putin is bombing Ukraine, bombing kindergarten. It's like, there's no context given. War is always horrible. It's not a good thing, but let's have some context. So anyway, I said, it's frustrating for me. I said something like, there are narratives and you got to be a critical thinker. And, there are lots of narratives back and forth. The lead teacher is a nice guy, young guy. He's sort of a semi-Quaker. He's sort of on the left, but he doesn't really back me up. I mean, he said a few things about Palestinians, but it didn't really back me up. Not much. I said a few things, but just to try to get people to think a little bit. We're up in the U.S., especially, many people say the American people are probably the most heavily propagandized people on the planet. Caitlin Johnstone said this, and I think she's absolutely right. We can get through some of the narrative. I mean, most teenagers don't give a shit about world events, no matter what happens. You can get them superficially riled up about something, but they really, even that, they don't really care. There's some video games and things. Okay, anyway. So in this video, I wanted to talk a little bit more about narratives and things going on. First, you may have heard there's a guy named Gonzalo Lira, and he's alive. Okay, some context. Who's Gonzalo Lira? Has amazing commentary, I think, on the Ukrainian conflict, what's going on. I first heard of him about 2 months ago Apparently, he's a Chilean American. Comes from a very wealthy, aristocratic Chilean family. His father was a diplomat. His grandfather was a high-ranking person figure in the Chilean military. Apparently, his family goes way. His aristocratic family were rivals to this guy Bernardo O'Higgins, famous Chilean revolutionary. His ancestors were rivals to Bernardo O'Higgins faction way back. Anyway, apparently Gonzalo Lira came to the U.S. as a little kid. His dual citizenship. He went to Dartmouth. He went to Dartmouth College. A writer. He got actually $1 million. When I think I read $1 million advance on his first book, which I know it's a thriller, which I haven't heard of until then. I don't know if that's common. And I don't know if that's common, but the guy is very well connected. He's politically on the right. He's fairly right wing. But having said that, his commentary on YouTube videos and elsewhere is amazing and something any leftist could and should agree with. He talks about the corruption of the Zelensky regime, the horrible role of the U.S., the Maidan coup, Victoria Nuland, the neocons, the IMF and World Bank, the horrible role of U.S. imperialism in Ukraine. And he sounds like a leftist. Weird. You think some people in the comment section call him comrade. I mean, in a good way, sounds like something any leftist would say. Very oddly, he tends to be on the right, but his background is like he made videos in a YouTube channel, Coach Red Pill. Apparently, he was like something like a dating coach. Yeah, well, he's a writer, filmmaker. He has some business going on in Ukraine. He moved to Ukraine years ago, maybe like 10 years ago. I don't know why. I don't know what he does there. He's a family, wife and kids who are Ukrainian, or his wife's Ukrainian. He got them out. I don't know where they are. But so interesting cat, really interesting cat. In a series of videos, he talks about the corruption. He talks about the role of the CIA in Ukraine. In fact, he talks this term glowy, like he knows who's who the American expat community in Kiev, in Ukraine, the high level expat community. He knows who's a glowy, like who's a CIA asset, who isn't, and he calls out various people. I mean, he's kind of dangerous what he's doing. And I really love his commentary. He's against the mainstream narrative anyway, and he's right. I think he's anyway. He mentioned that the an online newspaper, the Daily Beast, tried to get him killed. The Daily Beast is kind of a liberal, maybe a liberal left journal there. I don't read them. I've scanned through it occasionally. It's like kind of like the Huffington, cross between the Huffington Post and Vice, maybe. Like the Huffington Post, more edgy. They're kind of liberal, but yeah, I don't know. I don't regularly read it, but they did a hit piece on Gonzalo Lira. And any figure who's going to go against the mainstream narrative gets a hit piece. The hit piece, like most hit pieces, it was superficial. They didn't engage any of the points he made. They say he's a Putin apologist. He's a Putin puppet. Just take it for granted. He's just a Putin puppet. They didn't really develop any case against him. But the clincher, and it was written by a guy named Martin Hay, the clincher of this article, it said, we're contacting the Ukrainian government for information on him. So he's the Ukrainian government's biggest U.S. resident Chilean American critic. I mean, he's a very intense critic of the Ukrainian government, the corruption, the fascist groups, the Banderites, the Nazis. He calls them out. As Martin Hay, this person was contacting the Ukrainian government, like they're trying to get him. He said this, they're trying to get me killed. And he covered this whole thing, they're trying to get me killed. And so anyway, he mentioned before this incident, that he lived in an apartment in Kharkov. I believe it was an apartment. And in your apartments often have a concierge, like someone at a desk, and somebody sits at a desk and checks people in and out and stuff, a bit like a hotel. So he said he went out for a cigarette break. He has a room or apartment or something. He went for a cigarette break in Kharkov. And when he was coming back in, the concierge told him that, the Banderites are looking for you. A bunch of men, armed men. They didn't look very friendly. They were looking for him. They went up to his apartment, and unfortunately, he wasn't there. They were pounding on his door, and they were looking for him. So Gonzalo Lira thought, oh shit, I better get out of here. And he did. He was underground for at least a month or so after that. Still in Kharkov. Obviously, wouldn't say where he was. He was in they were after him. He was in a dangerous situation. What he said probably happened. What happened is videos were rebroadcast in Russia. Apparently, RT or some internal Russian network picked up some of his YouTube videos, chopped it up into smaller segments. It bounced around Russian social media for a while. It's in English, but bounced around Russian social media, was rebroadcast in Ukraine as like an American who hates Zelensky, who supports the Russians, even though he didn't really support the Russians, but an American who supports the Russians. Oh shit! And they were looking for him after that. He described what had happened. So this was before the incident with this online journal that was trying to get him killed. So what happened is about a week ago, he dropped out of sight. Gonzalo Lira dropped out of sight. He said, if you don't hear from me within like 12 hours, you can assume something that they got me. Something happened. He had to list on his Twitter account. He was on Twitter account. He had listed like a dozen or so people who were killed in Ukraine. There were a couple of journalists who went against the government, mayors, one mayor who was brutally murdered. I seriously think close to a dozen people who were horribly killed. And he said, if you don't hear from me within like so many hours, he's regular on social media and on the internet. He's regular. And he has a lot of followers. He's not just some obscure figure. He has a lot of followers. So if you don't hear from me, you think something's happened. So people didn't hear from him for about 6-7 years. Actually, it turned out to be, I think it was 6 days. And people were really worried. So, and including myself, even though I disagree with the guy's politics, I felt, guy's an amazing commentator, a very valuable asset in understanding what was happening here. He says he doesn't speak Ukrainian or Russian, but you can learn a lot just being there. Even if you don't speak the language. I lived in Moscow, Russia for a time, and I could pick up what was happening, even though I studied Russian, but I didn't really speak enough but I picked up English language papers, talking to people who spoke English, a little Russian I could pick up. I picked up a lot. I could pretty much tell a lot about what was going on. So yeah, he soaked up a lot about what was going on. Anyway, he dropped out of sight for a while, for almost a week, and people were worried. So Scott Ritter, another commenter we'll talk about, Scott Ritter had this tweet. He said, he brought out the theory. The tweet was not worded that well, but he put out, he thinks possibility Gonzalo Lira was killed. This is what happens to people. He didn't say Gonzalo Lira was killed, but he said there's a possibility when these Nazi groups got him. Someone else picked up Scott Ritter's tweet, modified it, and essentially said that this group called Kraken, which is a branch of the Azov or Azov battalion. It's called it's not a battalion, it's much larger, but a branch of Azov, it's a Nazi group in Mariupol. They got him and tortured him to death. And that got all over social media. So a lot of people, including myself, thought the worst. So this Nazi group, the Kraken, which is a branch of the Azov, claimed there was a buzz going around that they killed him. And oh boy, I felt really bad. Fortunately, he resurfaced a few days ago. Gonzalo Lira surfaced. By the way, after he was gone, as I mentioned, he said the Daily Beast is trying to get me killed, and they likely were. They quite literally were. There was this a journalist or quote journalist, what's her name? I think it was Cheryl Ashton Cirillo, who's trans, who embedded herself, and supposedly an independent journalist. She embedded herself, she's American, embedded herself with the Azov, with the fascist Azov battalion group. And she's obviously trans. And she was on Twitter. She was like cheering. She's some connection with the Daily Beast, and she's a Democratic Party operative as well. She had some weird, she's spying on this group for the local Democratic Party in Utah, or some weird situation. And she's working with the Daily Beast, some weird stuff going on there. But anyway, she was like cheering on Gonzalo Lira being murdered. And she said there's another journalist named Patrick Lancaster, an American who lives in Donbass, who has amazing photojournalism. He doesn't take sides because he has amazing photojournalism showing the atrocities of these Nazi groups. And this person said, just cheering on to Patrick, you're next. That was horrible. This shows, how vicious. And talk about Twitter. Scott Ritter, Pepe Escobar were taken off Twitter. A bunch of Palestinian rights activists were taken off Twitter. So many people were taken off Twitter, but yet it's okay. Some of these people were open. Ashton Cirillo or some of these other people were openly talking about they were seriously talking about who to liquidate, who to kill. You can do that on Twitter, but you can't do, it's so insane. So it's definitely the whole media is enforcing one very narrow narrative. Okay, anyway, this guy Gonzalo Lira resurfaced. I first found out about him on the Duran YouTube channel, which I'll talk about in a minute. He actually appeared on the Duran like 2 days. He came into Kiev, flew into Kiev from, I guess, the US or someplace, flew into Kiev. He'd been living in Ukraine for years and years, but he flew back to Ukraine like 2 days after the invasion, after the Russian invasion. He was stuck in his hotel for like a week or something, and he was going stir crazy. He said this, he's going stir crazy, but finally went to Kharkov, and he had frequent appearances on the Duran YouTube channel, where he talked about some amazing stuff, and he's on other channels as well. Anyway, he reappeared. He was on the Duran. Recently, he's been on Richard Midhurst, the Convo Couch, a variety of other channels. And I feel really he's safe. I mean, what happened is the SBU, Ukrainian State Security, arrested him. They got him. They apparently 5 or 6 people got him. He was rattled. They didn't kill him. They didn't beat him, as far as I know. He says legally he can't talk about his case. Which I don't know, they're charging him with something. He has to be careful what he says. It's just going through the courts or something. My guess what happened, they didn't disappear him. They didn't kill him. My guess what happened, he is very well connected. He may have friends in the CIA, although I think the CIA pretty much hates him. My hunch, they probably put a hit out on him, but I don't know this for sure. But he is well connected. And there was pressure put on. The U.S. doesn't care about him, but his dual U.S. Chilean citizenship. The Chilean embassy and Chilean government got involved. This probably saved his life, at least for now. So this is some of the risks journalists can take. And I consider them a journalist. The narrative, when you can get liberals cheering on your death, really seriously. Liberals allied with fascists who are cheering on him being murdered. This is insane. But okay, so anyway, I'm going to briefly talk about some venues I find out information. Or do not, if you want to know what's going on in Ukraine or any other place in the world, do not listen to CNN, NPR, MSNBC, Fox, pretty much any other mainstream corporate outlet. There are a variety of leftist, libertarian and centrist and even moderate conservative outlets, which give you a much better perspective. Personally, I think with Ukraine war is the Duran. Their YouTube channel is also on Rumble and Odyssey. I'm on Rumble and Odyssey too. I haven't quite figured out how the platforms work. Like I'm synced my YouTube account with Odyssey, so some of my videos transferred over, but most of them didn't. I had to sign some click something that I have over 300 subscribers. I don't. So maybe that's why they didn't all transfer. I got to look into it. I think it's a matter of time before YouTube bans this or it takes my content off. Anything outside very narrow narrative is under attack. So anyway, I'm also on Rumble. Most of my videos I made last couple of months are on Rumble. I got to work on that a bit more, but for now, mostly focused on YouTube, but it's not going to last forever. Okay, so anyway, the Duran are two basically Greek guys. An older, I think he's Greek, Cypriot, British guy named Alexander Makouris. He was a former lawyer. I don't know his whole background. He was a lawyer, and he worked in the finance sector for a time. He's an interesting guy. He has a large bookshelf behind him, like me. He has horrible wallpaper, but he's a wealth of information. He knows tons of stuff. Some mistakes are a little wrong, but he does know a lot of stuff. He's really interesting to listen to. He's not a leftist. He's more like, I say their outlook is kind of more right, conservative, populist, anti-imperialist. They would call it anti-globalist, but I think it dovetails with the leftist view. he and his other guy does it is well, it was Alex, forget his last name, and I don't want to look it up right now, but Alex and Alexander, two Greek. He's a younger Greek man. Alex, forget his last name, but I believe he's Greek American. He lives in Nicosia, Cyprus, and he does. They also have videos that they do on their own, but they work together. It's called the Duran, Duran. I don't know the significance of the name, but they do some interesting content. It's a place to go to if you want to know what's going on in Ukraine. Not that I agree with all their takes or everything they say. They're anti-communist, by the way, which is a little annoying. Some of their stuff is annoying, but they're definitely worthwhile to get a basic grasp of alternate viewpoints, what's happening in Ukraine. So there's some really first place to go to. Another guy, again, Scott Ritter, is a really interesting guy. He doesn't have a YouTube channel. As far as he doesn't have a YouTube channel, but he's interviewed recently by a lot of people, a lot of leftists, and some more populist conservative YouTubers. Scott Ritter was a former Marine, U.S. Marine Corps. He was a Marine intelligence officer in the first Iraq War, I believe. And after that, he was a weapons inspector. He was a UN, worked for the UN, not the U.S. government. The UN is a weapons inspector, make sure, Iraq was in compliance with the nuclear. They weren't going to build a nuclear bomb or whatever UMDs or whatever. And he was a big figure in that program. He was under enormous pressure by the Clinton administration to fudge statistics or to allow himself to be used politically to bash Iraq. They were building this case as another invasion of Iraq. And he had a run-in with Madeleine Albright. He had a lot of integrity. He resisted that, and they hated him. They hated his guts. Interesting, he was in jail for pedophilia. I'll explain. I don't know every detail of it. And he's not a pedophile. He didn't hurt anyone. He did some stupid stuff. But what I understand what happened, I think he was living in Pennsylvania, and someone online or contacted some communication with somebody online who was pretending, turned out to be an FBI agent, who was pretending to be an underage girl. And Scott Ritter claims he knew this person was pretending, was role playing, he knew this person was older. And I think he had some truth. And he sent them Scott Ritter sent this person this was an older woman, they were role playing. Anyway, Scott Ritter sent this person some sexually explicit stuff. And the FBI, it was an FBI sting operation. The FBI arrested him. He did something like 2 years in jail in Pennsylvania. He got out. There was another charge, similar charge someplace else. I don't know all the details. He was set up. They had it in for him, which went up against the Clinton administration. They wanted to destroy him. He admittedly did some pretty stupid stuff himself. And as I understand, the charge was being vacated in the state of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, as far as I understand. I don't know all the details. He's one of those things. He didn't commit pedophilia. He didn't hurt anyone. He did something really stupid, but they had it in for him. You got to be extremely careful what you do online. And if he did something like that, I'm not apologizing for it, but I think suggest right now we listen to his analysis, which is extremely interesting. Go over, watch. He doesn't have a YouTube channel, but just type in Scott Ritter. Lots of people. Richard Merhurst has interviewed him. The Convo Couch has interviewed him. Jackson Hinkle has interviewed him. A lot of leftists, and Duran has interviewed him. Gonzalo Lira has interviewed him. A lot of people have interviewed him, and he makes a really good case. Scott Ritter would, rather than me recapitulating what he says, listen to him, but basically says, the media narrative is complete bullshit. Basically, Russia is winning. They made some mistakes in the beginning. They got bogged down. They had a lighter force. They, got Russia first invaded. They had a light force, and what to do with a light touch. They got faulty intel from, in fact, FSB people have been arrested. Might be either incompetence or possibly sabotage. We don't know what happened, but in the first 2 weeks, the Russians realized their mistake. They beefed up their force. They are winning. They never want to take Kiev. They partially surrounded Kiev, but the idea wasn't to capture Kiev. It was to pin down 40,000 troops while they took Mariupol and the Donbass. Now, their way of war, Russians' way of warfare is much from the U.S. warfare. It's like shock and awe, bomb the shit out of everything, just utter destruction. The Russian model warfare is more slowly, methodically, and they don't want to do a lot of damage. They don't want to damage civilian infrastructure. They don't want to kill civilians. Where I live, the local rag, the Portland Press Herald, it's kind of liberal. I don't really read it that often. The Portland Press Herald a couple of weeks ago said, one of the headline article was, the Russians are now indiscriminately bombing civilians. Like, no, they're not. I'm not saying they're angels, but they're not. They basically want the Ukrainian people to like them. They do regard them as fellow Slavic people, closely related peoples, and they're not doing this. Not saying good, but they're not doing this. Anyway, so Scott Ritter's analysis is interesting. He's gotten a few things a little wrong. One thing he early on said that Mariupol, like second week of the invasion, second week was something like Mariupol had fell and the Azov battalion was wiped out. He was wrong. He got this from a guy named Russell Bentley, who's also an interesting cat. He's an American communist in Donbass. He's from Texas, Tejas from Donbass. He was taken off YouTube, but you can find him on Telegram and elsewhere. Interesting cat. Anyway, Scott Ritter got this from Russell Bentley. He was wrong, but otherwise, Scott Ritter has a extensive military background. He explains all the military logistics, what's going on, and he really has a worthwhile analysis. One of the best commentators I know on this. You can find a lot of people are interviewing now on leftist YouTube channels. Another guy is Jack Dreisen. I don't know him really well. He was on the Duran. I think he's a conservative blogger, YouTuber, something like that. I'm not really super familiar with him, but he has an interesting analysis. It's pretty much similar to Scott Ritter. Some differences in emphasis, a little difference, a little more slower. Not Scott Ritter's a little, might say overly enthusiastic for Russia's military ability. Jack Dreisen a little more hesitant, but in both interesting commentary. Another person, Mark Sloboda, and I haven't seen a lot of him. He's an American. I think he lives in Moscow for years, and he was on the Convo Couch of a variety of other YouTubers. He's an interesting cat. Okay, now there's YouTubers, some bloggers where I get information from are interesting. One called Moon of Alabama. It's a blog. The title comes from the Alabama song, Kurt Weill. The Doors, Jim Morrison, it's only the way to the next whiskey bar. I can't sing. I won't even try. I'm not going to quit my day job. So anyway, the Moon of Alabama, I'm talking about geopolitics from an anti-imperialist perspective. And mostly that, and the Duran's been focusing on the Ukraine war. So the guy who runs it is a German, I believe, retired German aerospace engineer, Bernard, goes by the name of Bernard. And the really interesting commentary, and there's a whole community of commenters on it. Some of the comments are weird, wacko, conspiracy theory stuff. Some of it really makes sense, really insightful. So it's worth reading. Another one, finally, is Vineyard of the Saker. It's run by a guy named Andre, I don't know his last name. He's a Russian nationalist. I believe he's part Swiss, but I'm not sure. He's retired Red Cross relief worker. He married an American woman, got U.S. residency. So of all places, he's a Russian nationalist living in St. Petersburg, Florida, of all places. It's in English, blogs in English. And he has a variety of writers, more or less along the same line, but a variety of writers write about what's happening in Russia, the Ukraine war. He's enthusiastically pro-Russian. He doesn't hide it at all. In a lot of these people see, zone A, zone B. It's more than just, it's proxy war between US and Russia, obviously, but it's also a clash between US hegemony and the global South, China, Latin America, so many things going on. It's not just, it is obviously a proxy war, US and Russia, but there's so much, whole world system, colliding world systems in some ways. So, so Vineyard Saker is interesting. Some of the writers, they were better than those. Some of it's a bit cringy. He's culturally, Andre guy who has this blog, he's culturally really conservative. He's anti-LGBT, anti-transgender. He's culturally conservative. He's basically a Russian nationalist. He's anti-communist. He's not a right winger exactly. He talks about U.S. imperialism and the IMF, and so he's interviewed Roger Waters, which is really interesting. He's a big Roger Waters fan. I didn't think he was the type who would be, and some of his, like the phrases of some of their articles, is borderline anti-Semitism, which I don't like. Talks about the Anglo-Zionist Empire. It's a little cringe. Some of his the phrases they use are a little cringy, but I read it. It does have a wealth of information. It is really interesting. They have translated articles from the Russian Ministry of Defense, and it's really worthwhile watching if you want to know what's going on. Okay, those are some commenters, the main ones. There are others who I'm probably forgetting or don't know about right now. I'm on Telegram, which is an app. It's like censorship free so far. It's kind of the model. It's kind of halfway between Twitter and Facebook. The method, their channels. You can pick a channel. You can start a channel, and people post commentary and videos, and photos and things like that. I'm not on it yet. I mean, I subscribe to it, and there are a bunch. They're all zillion channels. There is censorship free. They're Ukrainian sources who post on it. A lot of Russian stuff on there too. I have one Intel Slava Z is an interesting channel. I get the Russian Ministry of Defense. Pepe Escobar is interesting. A bunch of commenters who are on Telegram. Really, really interesting stuff. Some of it's not just somebody wanted to mention Patrick Lancaster. He's an American, I guess, photojournalist. He's in Donbass. He's amazing photography. One of his things, and he's on YouTube. They haven't taken him off YouTube. He's still on YouTube. One of his videos really harrowing, the basement of an elementary school, which the Azov people and Ukrainian Azov battalion and the Ukrainian military used as like a base for a time. There's a body of a woman, Ukrainian woman, who was killed, and she has a swastika in blood drawn on her chest. It's horrifying. It's horrifying. It's beginning of this video, I mentioned CNN 10. They had this element. They don't mention stuff like this. They don't mention this at all, but stuff I picked up is really the Ukrainian Nazis is really horrifying. Okay, so Patrick Lancaster is really, really interesting cat and enormous. Some of these people have enormous courage for what they're doing. Russell Bentley is interesting too. He's from Texas. He was apparently bounced around a long period of his life, bounced around. Like me for that matter. Apparently did 5 years in jail for smuggling marijuana smuggling operation. He was a beach bum. His family owns a restaurant in San Pedro Island in Texas. And he was at work there for a while. He was kind of a surfer. And he was a Green Party activist. He became disgusted by the wokeism of the American left. I kind of agree with him, although he's kind of old school in some ways, but he somehow went to Ukraine, went to Donbass, like after 2014. He joined a communist group there, and he fought a communist militia. I don't know which one he fought for it. And he's in his 60s. He's over fighting age, but he's involved in humanitarian relief, sending food to the people, beleaguered people of Donbass in that region. He has interesting commentary. He gets some things wrong. He's very overly enthusiastic about stuff. I like the guy a great deal. One of the most interesting people I know, but gets a few things wrong, but interesting cat. Some commentators that I know of, and I know there are good commentators. Oh God, I can't think of the guy. Oh, another commentary, Andrei Martyanov, a Russian. It's in English. He's a kind of a folksy guy, kind of a funny guy. He has kind of a self-deprecating sense of humor. He's amazing military geopolitical analysis. Very laid-back guy. Oh, it's me, Andrei. I'm still alive. They haven't killed me yet, and I'm just here. I have my big beer belly. He's kind of funny to listen to. His trip, and he has Martynov has some amazing analysis. I haven't listened to a lot of him, but he has a lot of respect in this community, like community of anti-imperialists who are following the Ukraine war. Andrei Martyanov is a really good resource. Other people who cover Ukraine, not there especially, but they cover it, is Pepe Escobar. He's a journalist, foreign correspondent, a Brazilian journalist. I have a couple of his books. He writes a lot of stuff about the Eurasian integration, China's One Belt, One Road initiative, and all that stuff. He's very enthusiastic about it. I thought he was a little too uncritical about it, but he has some amazing interviews. I believe Richard Medhurst interviewed him on YouTube, and Danny Haifang. I have interviews with him on YouTube, worth watching. I may not agree with everything he says, but worth watching. There's another guy, one more guy I want to talk about, Micheal Hudson, an economist. Now, he's probably, I remember, you may remember the Das Equus beer ad, the most interesting man in the world. He was kind of take off on Ernest Hemingway, middle-aged guy with a beard, who's, most interesting, stay thirsty, my friends. Kind of, anyway, this Micheal Hudson literally, I think, is the most interesting man in the world. I don't know, I think he's in his 80s, maybe 90s by now, probably in his 80s. He's literally Leon Trotsky's godson. His parents were in the Trotskyist movement, were in the Communist League, which split from the Communist Party and later formed the Socialist Workers' Party. They were active in the Teamsters Rebellion, Teamsters Strike, 1934 in Minneapolis. They were very active in that. They were socialist, communist revolutionaries. He says, Micheal Hudson says, they brought him up. They raised him to be a communist revolutionary, assuming the situation was right, and it wasn't. And the Second World War and the long boom and stuff, it didn't quite play out that way, but just the same. And when Micheal Hudson went into academia, became an economist, he was on Wall Street for a time. He worked for the Hudson Institute, which is no relation as far as I know, but he's at the Hudson Institute, worked with Herman Kahn, famous guy in the 60s, sort of a bit of a psycho case, regarded as a bit of a psycho case, but Herman Kahn had a theory of nuclear escalation. It's possible to survive a nuclear war. Herman Kahn, to his credit, said, it's possible to survive a nuclear war, but I don't want to live in that type of world. He wasn't as crazy as he's stereotyped to be, according to Micheal Hudson. I was familiar with Herman Kahn, but so anyway, Micheal Hudson says, I understand the neocons. I understand because I worked with them. That was an earlier generation of neocons. So anyway, after that, Micheal Hudson was also, he had another career as a musician. Apparently, he was a conductor of the Stockholm Philharmonic, which is pretty wild. And then he was an archaeologist, not like Indiana Jones type. He wasn't a dig, but apparently he was interested in Mesopotamian debt, like throughout history, how states and societies organized debt and in their economic system. And he was fascinated by Mesopotamia, the economic system of Mesopotamia. And apparently he was like officially and what they call an Assyrianologist, like saying ancient Assyria, not Syria, Assyria, the ancient civilization of Mesopotamia. And he was at the Peabody Museum outside Boston. And he was kind of an expert in Assyrianology. Guy's pretty amazing, interesting dude. Okay, so I just want to talk about some of his takes and bears on what's going on. It's more than just, obviously more than just it's a proxy war in US and Russia. And there are people, a lot of people on the Facebook left said, we shouldn't take a side on the left or the working class or socialists. We shouldn't take a side on both US and Russia are capitalist imperialist countries, and we don't have a stake in it, or that, the working class of Ukraine, the Russian speaking and Ukrainian speaking working class should unite and kick out NATO on one hand, or kick out Russia on the other hand. Actually a lot of people on the Facebook left who are openly saying that NATO should send more weapons to Ukraine. I mean, seriously, the International Viewpoints, which is a journal connected with the Fourth International, which supposedly Trotskyist, I don't know what they're one article was openly advocating NATO sending weapons so we should send more weapons to Ukraine. Like, what? This guy, John Riemann, who was one of the founders or leaders of Socialist Alternative Group I was in, he was expelled very early on. I kind of used to like the guy, but then he got extremely weird. He's like an anti-imperialist, like along the line of Louis Pryak and so on. He was again openly advocating NATO to send more weapons to Ukraine. Like, what? Anyway, okay, so anyway, some of these narratives I disagree with. Yeah, Russia is capitalist, absolutely. Micheal Hudson makes the case that misses the point. He says, according to the IMF, 70% of Russia's GDP comes from the state sector, and the IMF thinks that's too much. But 70%, and the 12 largest companies in Russia are state-run. Russia is capitalist, like the commanding heights, much of it is in private hands. Agriculture and so on is in private hands, absolutely. So you can't say it's like Trotsky's term, a deformed worker state, and people use China. Some people think China is socialist. That's a whole separate debate. But you can't say Russia is socialist. You can't say that. or any type of socialism, deformed worker state, or you can't say that about Russia. But it is, Micheal Hudson says, it is different. It is different from neoliberal capitalism, and that's an important difference. Is like the 90s were a horrible time for Russia. Okay, and under Putin, not that Putin can be criticized. Putin is a capitalist leader, yeah, sure, but it's the standard of living is much higher than it was in the 90s. The neocon project is to break up Russia into five or six smaller countries. That's a neocon project. Break up and bring it back to the 90s, keep U.S. hegemony going forever. Micheal Hudson spells us out. So, okay, so the idea also in broader sense is not just, they'll be cheering when Russia wins, and they will win. They'll be cheering in Cuba, Venezuela, the entire global South, Cuba, Venezuela, Honduras, Bolivia, so the people in Palestine, the working class of Iran. I don't care about the theocracy, but the working class of Iran, under brutal U.S. sanctions, the working class of Lebanon, Syria, so many places will be cheering this on. Will be cheering on a Russian victory. It's not just a proxy war between U.S. and Russia, proxy war in U.S. imperialism and the global South. To be really blunt about it, two big systems. And the Russians and the Chinese can be criticized. They have a lot to be criticized for, absolutely. But I think U.S. hegemony is the worst. Madeleine Albright, who died recently, she was saying killing 500,000 Iraqi children was worth it, and she's responsible for it. She was responsible for these sanctions under the Clinton administration. Okay. U.S. killed 500,000 children in Iraq. Russia didn't do it. Iran didn't do it. China didn't do it. None of these countries are capable of doing it. Assad didn't do it. Venezuela didn't do it. North Korea did. The U.S. did it. The only country capable of doing it. So pushing back U.S. imperialism, moving towards a multipolar world can be nothing but a much, much healthier situation. So anyway, back to Micheal Hudson. What he says is, he thinks this conflict will go on for a very long time, maybe decades. And it's what he thinks, it's a war against proxy war, U.S. and Russia. This is largely a war between U.S. and its allies. It's a war against Germany, U.S. war against Germany, France on one hand, against South Korea and Japan on the other hand. It's to keep these countries prevent Eurasian integrationism, and keep them locked into U.S. imperialism. Now, I want to mention this. I'm a little jumbled here. Micheal Hudson, he's a Marxist of sort of an eccentric variety. He says people ask what I am. He says I'm a classicist. I'm a classical economist, like what they call classical economics from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and so on. He says, Micheal Hudson says, the original program of classical English economics was against unearned income. Like Adam Smith is often stereotyped as being very pro-capitalism. A lot of ways he was, but he also railed against rentier economy, quit rent. He railed against that, against any type of unearned income. He wrote in late 18th century Britain, which was big remnants of feudalism existed, large landowners and so on. He railed against this. He was critical of capitalism in some ways. He wasn't quite how he's been stereotyped a lot of times. And then David Ricardo, Micheal Hudson says Marxism is the logical final culmination of classical economics. It's not so much a break with it, it's a full development of it. This interesting take, really interesting take. Marxism is the culmination of classical economics. Today, we don't have classical economics in mainstream academia or economists. We have neoclassical economics, which is based on a guy, Alfred Marshall in 1880s, 1890s, English economist. What they talk about marginal utility and focus a lot on supply and demand stuff, which is what we think of economics today, which is one tiny subset of it. The whole idea, like the labor theory of value, which was developed by Adam Smith and their version by David Ricardo and finally Marx. Marx wrote about theories of surplus value. The theory of surplus value and the labor theory of value is extremely embarrassing for mainstream bourgeois economists. And economics is much like bourgeois social sciences, developed in reaction to Marxism. It's the skeleton in the closet, like sociology, anthropology, so many things. I mean, mainstream like bourgeois science, social science does have some insight. I'm not going to dismiss it, but a lot of it developed like in reaction to Marxism, that the working class is the creator of all value, and some of the stuff is pretty subversive. and a huge amount of effort to make sure people don't realize this. So anyway, what was I saying? Micheal Hudson mentions this. He says, industrial capitalism was supposed to transition into socialism, like this expectation of the socialists in the early 20th century, time of Eugene Debs or whatever, the idea that we were going to transition into socialism. Like there was like a lot of socialists actually welcomed monopoly capitalism, big monopolies and big trusts and stuff. They actually welcomed it. And this major socialization and collectivization of the economy is a very good thing. Like the capitalists are doing our work for us, and they're just going to fall into our hands and the hands of the working class like a ripe plum. And you could say, yeah, it's a bit of a naive idea and you're more complicated than that. It would maybe reproduce capitalist alienation. You work for a big combine under socialism just as much as under capitalism. But be that as it may, that was the idea that socialism was the culmination of industrial capitalism. It would require revolution, of course. No ruling class would give up power willingly, but it was supposed to be a transition. That was the expectation. Micheal Hudson mentions this didn't happen because of finance capital. I mean, he explains this a lot better than I could, but financialization developed alongside this and created wars. Like Lenin wrote, imperialism, the highest stage of capital. Like imperialism was a product of finance capital, greater financialization, pulling other capital beyond it, seeking outlets, seeking markets and things like that. So the reason why in financialization created wars, World War I, World War II created wars, prevented the logical development into socialism. There was a Russian Revolution in 1817. Micheal Hudson mentions that in a few other instances, but for the most part, we didn't have this transition in the major developed economies into socialism as was widely expected because of this finance capital. And he explains it better than I could. Then U.S. hegemony after the Second World War is a continuation of this. I mean, U.S. economy was productive, of course, but U.S. hegemony was and is highly parasitic. All empires are, but U.S. kept its power highly parasitic. And then he carries this for the neoliberalism today is really, imperialism is always parasitic, but neoliberalism is ultra parasitic. So there's a collision between different systems, really. He sees like Russia and China as more traditional industrial capitalism, or he believes he's more optimistic with China. He sees China as socialist. I know his definition of it might be a little different from mine. Micheal Hudson seems to take more of a top-down view of socialism, and he almost seems to equate traditional industrial capitalism with socialism. And I may have some disagreements with him. I seriously may have some disagreements with him, but he does have a lot of insights, definitely worth engaging with. And his main work on the left is called Super Imperialism. He had 3 or 4 different editions of it. I read it years ago. I want to read the updated version of it. Basically explains how U.S. imperialism works. Talk about the Britain, U.S. hegemony after the Second World War, based on the gold standard and things like that. That broke down in the Nixon administration, in the early 70s, 1970s. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. And there was, after a couple of years of chaos, a new system based on petrodollars. Saudi Arabia, especially recycling petrodollars, kept the value of the dollar high, enabled the U.S. to borrow tons of money, enabled the U.S. to have this gigantic military establishment, which also props up the value of the dollar. And he explains this now, this system is starting to unravel. And Micheal Hudson goes on to say that, it's a war between U.S. and Russia, but war in USSR is like, he says something like, this will be the 3rd time in a little over 100 years that the U.S. defeated Germany. Like the U.S. defeated Germany, World War I, World War II. It's doing it again. These sanctions are insane. I mean, they're hurting Europe big time. Like they're not European Union is not said not to pay rubles. They're not buying Russian gas with natural gas, which they're highly dependent on. There's talk of actually not buying Russian oil. This is going to be an economic catastrophe for Europe, especially Germany. And Germany is just the leadership. Olaf Scholz is going head as like an obedient puppy dog. He's going headlong into this. It's just insane. The Duran talks about how insane this is. Micheal Hudson talks about how insane this is from different perspectives. And Micheal Hudson, he says, I don't know if it's the Ukraine war or the struggle. He sees the struggle as two poles, to really between social. He sees this as class warfare, global class warfare. Whether, I think there's a lot of truth to what he says. He thinks the struggle will go on for decades. It'll go on for decades. And interesting take, sad, but really interesting take. We are at a very much of a pivotal time here. Hi, one, another guy, Jim Kavanaugh. I've interviewed him 3 times before. I largely align with his politics. He's a socialist. I don't know a lot of his background, but he's a socialist. He writes for the Polemicist, really, and he's had really consistently really good articles. He had, recent article, thinks he's gonna, the logic of the situation of the Ukraine war is U.S. involvement, direct U.S. involvement. First, most likely it's most likely it'll be like U.S. is trying to make it like Russia's Afghanistan or Iraq, keep it going as long as possible. The main thing would be to tell Zelensky to surrender. The Russians, they can't win. The Russians are winning overwhelmingly. It's very bloody. Like 60, 70,000 young Ukrainian men will be killed. It's horrible. I don't like to see this. Nobody does. Or some people do, but I don't like to see this. And, if you care about Ukrainian people, you'll wish for a quick Russian victory. This thing should be over. But U.S. Zelensky's a puppet. He's not. He's a puppet. He's most likely in Poland right now. The U.S. won't let him surrender. That's a tragedy. The U.S. won't let him surrender. So anyway, possibly this thing could go on for a really long time. It looks like Ukraine will be partitioned, the Donbass republics, the Novorossiya, they're in several oblasts, they're in Kherson too. See, 3 regions are close to seceding from Ukraine, declaring a republic. So they may be another state, Novorossiya, or they may be part of Russia. The U.S. media is making this, it's a land grab. No, it's just, okay, anyway. So this U.S. is pumping, Biden has $33 billion for this, and Congress will probably give a lot more. In speech, Biden came off like he has severe dementia. He just couldn't get the words out. Anyway, so it could go on for a long time. It could be literally U.S. The neocons very badly wants to get in the group around Biden, very badly want to get us into a direct military confrontation with Russia. The media, CNN is whipping this up. The logic of it kind of calls for U.S. boots on the ground, which would be a war with Russia. And you can see these pretty little mushroom clouds. They're normalizing nuclear war, by the way. They're both sides are talking about literal nuclear war. It's scary. I don't know how it's going to play out. We're in for a probably, if not in Ukraine, but decades-long struggle. U.S. empire is dying. I don't know what's happening. No, I like Micheal Hudson. His view is a bit more top-down. He wouldn't say, he talked about the Amazon strike, Amazon unionization. Someone asked Micheal Hudson, what is the prospect of the American working class taking power, class struggle, making a meaningful difference? He said, well, the working class could take power in the U.S. probably around 2090. Like, he was being kind of sarcastic. It's not going to happen. There's the influence of the Democratic Party, the NGOs, the massive indoctrination, brainwashing American people have from the media, and so on. So anyway, but Jim Kavanaugh has a really depressing take on it, but he's probably right. The logic, the war is expanding, by the way. There's buzz going around. I don't know what the current thing is, but the Poland has won. There's this agreement. Apparently, the Russian Ministry of Defense claims there was some agreement between U.S. and Poland back in March that Poland is going to grab or occupy west parts of Western Ukraine. That used to be part of Poland back in the 1920s. They're going to grab Western. There's some secret agreement worked out, like very well could be true. Poland hotly denies it. It's up in the air whether Russia would be okay with it. Maybe they don't really mind. They would take attack Eastern Ukraine. Poland can do whatever they want with the rump state. But I don't know. Also, area of Transnistria, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Okay, brief, there's Romania, which is Latin-speaking country, speak the Latin language. They're in Eastern Europe. Their language, as I know, Romania is closest to French, as far as I understand. It's also religion Eastern Orthodox, so they're a combination of cultures. They're in Eastern Europe. They were part of the war. Well, they were not really part of the Warsaw Pact. They left the Warsaw Pact. Guy Ceausescu, who was an odd character. He was a leader, Stalinist leader. He was close to the IMF. He squeezed the country dry to pay for IMF loans. Anyway, odd character. There's nostalgia for him now. So how horrible capitalism is. There's nostalgia for the days of Ceausescu. Anyway, there's a breakaway area called Moldava or Moldavia. They were part of the Soviet Union. They're really not a breakaway area. They're ethnic Romanian. They speak Romanian or dialect of Romanian. There's some accents of history, how they ended up separate. They were a republic of the Soviet Union. They broke away, of course. Then when that happened, very early 90s, there was a section which broke away from Moldava called Transnistria. I'm not pronouncing it correctly. They're a Russian-speaking area. They seceded. They're not recognized as a state by anybody, although allied closely with Russia. There are a whole series, I think about a dozen of these different, like what they call frozen post-Soviet conflicts. Like the Soviet Union was ethnically very mixed, and when it broke up, there were areas, many people regard themselves as Soviets, not as Russians or Ukrainians or whatever. They were Soviets. And then, and other people like Russian-speaking people lived in non-Russian-speaking areas that interpenetrated nationalities. And so anyway, when it broke up, there were ethnic conflicts broke out, and there were areas which wanted to be closer. Russian-speaking people use language or cultural reasons were closer to Russia. There's area I can't think of the top of my head, breakaway area of Georgia, the country of Georgia, which they're not ethnic Russians, but they speak Russian. There was a war in 2007 or 8 or so. Anyway, there are a variety of breakaway regions. It was a mess. So anyway, this is one of those situations. And apparently there's talk of other bombings of Russian media installations in Transnistria. And there's talk of Romania invading Moldava or Romania invading Transnistria. So the possibility of the war is heating up. I think it's a matter of time before it expands. This is extremely scary. Finally, briefly, I'm going to end. I'm almost finished. My dog is giving me a hard time here. This is Max. If you can see Max, say hello. Say hello, Max. I'm just a little dog, and I'm just a little dog. Okay, anyway, so the take on much of the Facebook left is just horrible. I mentioned some of this. There's the journal called International Viewpoints. They're the journal, like online hard copy of the Fourth International, which is or was Trotskyists. They're kind of Mandelites. They're very diffuse. I don't know what they regard themselves as Trotskyists, what they're extremely diffuse. Anyway, this article called for socialists or people on the left should support NATO sending more weapons to Ukraine. Like, what? Okay, and this is a common sentiment on the Facebook left, seriously, which is why I don't politically align with most people on Facebook. Those leftist on Facebook. A few people I do, but most people say stuff. Most people on the Facebook left are pro-Ukrainian. I mean, I support the Ukrainian people, of course, but they're run by a fascist Nazi NATO dictatorship. Anyway, I go on for hours. Maybe another video. The Nazis didn't run Ukraine, but they had a big outstanding influence since 2014. Now they run. The U.S. and these Nazi groups, Azov and a bunch of other groups, they pretty much run Ukraine. Zelensky is a puppet, total, utter puppet. He's probably living in Poland. I hope I don't get this YouTube channel banned. And again, like every video I've made, there are probably stuff I wish I had said, but I'll just think about it right after it's over. Anyway, probably time for me to go. And again, if you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. It helps me build a channel. I'm working on near future videos, one on Taiwan, one on Rosa Luxemburg. And I'm hoping to interview a local Maine peace activist. Okay, peace out and keep up the struggle. Bye-bye.